Let's talk about a little bit about group by. If you remember, when we discussed group by last, right, we talked about a mechanism that allowed us to relate records that were in the same table, that had values that were repeating with one another, right, and be able to group them and classify them together as if it were, collapse them into one classification, and then that allowed us to aggregate all the other fields, right, sum them up, minimum, maximum, average, whatever, right? And we call them that we would apply aggregate functions to all those other fields. So we talked about the syntax, right, where we have selecting a particular set of columns, and we would apply the aggregate of the other columns, and we saw that also only the columns that we grouped by only ever made it to the select statement, right? You cannot list fields in the select clause that were not mentioned in the group by, right? Because all the other ones were gone, disappeared. You can only do aggregation of those other of these other fields, right? Because if you collapse first names, right? What do you do with them when you group them together? Are you going to concatenate them? I don't know. If it's numeric, maybe you could. You can average them out, and minify them. You can maxify or whatever. You can add them up. So just a couple examples here. We have a really simple order table. We have 3 folks: Alice, Bob, and Charlie. And if we group by the customer, we certainly can keep the customer field, right? But what about the IDs, the order IDs, and the order dates? What do we do with those? How do you collapse them together to compute what? The order date, maybe you can calculate the maximum date, the minimum date, right? The order price, maybe you could do the max, the min, the average, right? Or add them up. But the order ID, what do you do with those? You can't, there's no way to aggregate them in any way. So here's an example of having a group by the customer, and only the customer field makes it into the select statement. No other fields make it in there, right? They're gone. The only ones that the other ones, the most you could do is aggregate them into sum, min, max, average, and whatnot. We also looked at some edge cases where what if you omit, what if you use an aggregate, right? But you omit the group by, right? That's a weird case. Basically you add everything up, you return all the customers, but then all the resulting values would have the sum value. Grouping by multiple columns. What we do is that we take those 2 columns, and whenever they are the same, they belong to the same group, and then everything else stays the same, right? You have to group by, you have to calculate the aggregate of all the other fields. A couple examples here. If we're retrieving from the major, we're grouping by the major ID. The field graduation year has to be collapsed. What do you do with those? We are just calculating the min and the max. Here we're using the as min year and as max year. That's a good practice, right, to always name your fields when they're being aggregated. Otherwise, the naming convention of min, max, so different vendors name them differently. So you're not guaranteed that you will have the same name if you go from across vendors. So it's always a good idea to use as to specifically name the resulting fields. So there's a couple limitations that I wanted to point out with the group by, right? And it stems from the fact that group by is calculated after the where. Right? So first, the where clause runs and says, okay, I need to identify all the records that match the criteria, right? And says, okay, well, I'm going to compare, I'm going to iterate over my table, maybe join a couple of tables, yes, and identify which are the records that meet my criteria. So out of the thousands of records, I might end up with these 100 records that meet my criteria. So a subset of the original records. Once I've identified those records, now I can group. I can now iterate over and say, ooh, these are the same, they should go in the same group. And those are the same, they should go in a different group. Right? Once I've identified the groups, now I can run my select clause. Right? So group by happens right after the where, but before the select. before the select. And and because it happens between these two, there are some limitations of what you can do with group by. Right? Let's talk about some of these limitations. Okay. So let's go back to our trusty university database. So let's see. If you remember the example we used a while back, right? We wanted to calculate the number of A's and then the maximum number of A's in the section. So for instance, calculate the grade A so that we can see, how many A's we're giving out in each section. We took that and fed it into the next one, right? And then calculate what the max of number of A's was, right? And then when we had that, here's a visual representation of that. These are 3 different sections, section 1, 2, and 3. We have 2 A's, 3 A's, and 1 A, right? And so we group them by section ID, and we count how many A's we have. So it's going to come out with 2, 3, and 1. 2, 3, and 1. And then we group again, right? We do a max on that, and we come out with 3. So we know there's 3, right? Notice that when we get to a Q84, there's no way for us to know which section it was. It's gone. Right? The sections 1, 2, 3. I first identified, so the where ran where the grade is well, there's no where here, so it's all of them, right? So you identify all of them, and then you run the max. You run the max on the number of A's, right? So that gives us a limitation, that the section IDs are gone, right? So what if we wanted to? So we had a hack for this, right? The way to, if we wanted to know which section was that had the most, we can join these two, Q83 and Q84, and identify the section in the first one and say, well, which one is the one that has a 3? So that tells us section number 2. Right? Number 2 would say which one is the maximum. Obviously, the problem there is that, what if there's 2 sections that have the same number of A's? Right? There's no way for us to say, oh, well, it's these 2 sections. Right? There's no way to distinguish between the 2. So a thing that we would like to be able to do is something like this. Say, select maximum number of A's as max A's, right? Comma, oh, and by the way, tell me what the section is. Q that section ID, right? The problem that this is an illegal query because the section ID was never used in the group by, right? So you can't, that only fields that are in the group by or are being aggregated are allowed in the select statement, right? Because the where already occurred, right? And so the grouping happens. Once the grouping happens, you don't have any of the other fields. Now the select can happen. After the grouping, now the select happens, but it's too late. You already lost all the sections. So you can't put in the select, you cannot put the sections ID because the grouping already happened, right? And it's gone. Well, then you could say, well, what if we do it before? Not in select, we say, where Q number of A's is equal to the maximum Q of number of A's, right? We could have said that and get the section ID, but this is also illegal, right? We can't have aggregates, right? The syntax doesn't allow us to have aggregates in the where clause, right? Actually, it's too early, right? It's too early to do the aggregates because the where has to happen first. So we identify the records, then we can aggregate. Right? There's no way to do the aggregation right before the where happens. So this is kind of like trying to do the chicken and the egg, right? I can't do this. I can't do the max until I do the aggregation, but I can't do the aggregation until I do this where, right? So it's kind of like, so what do we do? So obviously there was a hack that we used. We joined both of the queries, Q83 and Q84, where the max was equal to the number of A's, right? And that told us what the section is. But The problem with this is that what if you have 2 or 3 sections that have the same number of A's? There's no way to tell us, oh, these are the 3 sections and whatnot, that, which one was it? All right, halving to the rescue.